In the unforgiving territory of the Wyoming Basin, where the mountains rose like jagged teeth against a slate-gray sky, the winter of 1888 was not merely a season, it was a verdict. The snow had been falling for 3 days straight, a relentless curtain of white that erased roads, buried fences, and swallowed sound. It was in this white purgatory that the town of Oak Haven sat, a cluster of shivering timber buildings filled with people who prided themselves on their godliness while turning a blind eye to the wretched. And it was miles outside this town, in a dilapidated shack that leaned dangerously against the howling gale, that Mai Lin lived. Mai Lin was a ghost in the eyes of the locals, a woman of Chinese descent who wore a plain white dress that seemed too thin for the freezing temperatures, a garment of mourning and purity that set her apart from the heavy woolens of the townsfolk. She was barely 20, with hands roughened by labor and eyes that held a quiet, ancient sorrow. The townspeople called her an outcast, a stranger, a stain on their decent community, forcing her to live on the very edge of the tree line where the soil was rocky and the shadows were long. She survived on meager rations and the charity of the earth, gathering roots and trapping small game, existing in a bubble of profound silence. On this particular evening, the storm was a living thing, battering the thin walls of her cabin. The wind screamed through the cracks, threatening to extinguish the small fire she had coaxed from damp kindling. Mai Lin sat by the hearth, stitching a tear in her hem, when a heavy thud against her door shattered the rhythm of the storm. It wasn't the wind, it was solid, heavy, and human. Fear, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. Visitors did not come to her door with good intentions. She waited, clutching a rusted iron poker, but only silence followed. Driven by a curiosity that outweighed her fear, she unlatched the heavy oak door and pushed it open against the drift. There, collapsed face down in the snow, lay a man. He was a mountain of a figure, dressed in fine but tattered black broadcloth that spoke of a life far removed from this wilderness, his dark hair matted with ice. He looked like a fallen titan, defeated not by an enemy, but by the sheer weight of his own heartbreak. The cold was an immediate physical assault, biting at Mai Lin's exposed skin with invisible teeth, urging her to retreat into the warmth, but she could not leave him. He was immense, his shoulders broad and heavy, buried half deep in the accumulating drift. Mai Lin dropped the iron poker and stepped into the snow, her canvas shoes instantly soaking through. She grabbed the stranger by the collar of his coat, pulling with all the strength her slender frame possessed. He was dead weight, a slab of granite wrapped in freezing wet wool. She gritted her teeth, her breath coming in ragged white puffs, and dug her heels into the threshold. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him across the rough wooden floorboards of her shack. The effort made her muscles scream, but there was a desperate tenacity in her movements. She was an underdog who had survived the scorn of an entire town. She would not let the winter claim a soul on her doorstep. When she finally managed to pull him completely inside, she kicked the door shut and threw the latch, the sudden silence of the room deafening after the roar of the wind. He lay on the floor, a puddle of melting snow forming around him, dark and ominous in the firelight. Mai Lin knelt beside him, her hands hovering for a moment before practical necessity took over. She turned him over. His face was pale, nearly blue, with a strong, square jaw and a beard that held droplets of ice. He was handsome in a severe, ruined way, like a statue toppled from its pedestal. She knew that if he remained in those wet clothes, the hypothermia would finish what the storm had started. With trembling fingers, she began to unbutton his heavy coat. It was fine wool, lined with silk, the clothing of a wealthy man, yet it was stained with mud and travel. Underneath, he wore a vest and a crisp white shirt that was now grey with sweat and grime. She worked methodically, stripping him down to his undergarments, her cheeks flushing not from impropriety but from the sheer exertion of maneuvering his limp, heavy limbs. She dragged her only quilt, a patchwork of faded cottons, and draped it over him, then moved him closer to the fire. His skin was like ice to the touch. She rushed to her small pantry, grabbing a jar of dried ginger and fierce peppers. She needed to warm him from the inside out if he ever woke. As she worked, grinding the herbs with a stone, she noticed a silver band on his left hand. A wedding ring. But there was no shine to it, it was dull, scratched, as if he had spent hours rubbing it against something hard, or perhaps punching stone walls in fits of grief. He was a widower, the aura of loss clung to him more tightly than the cold. The night stretched on, an eternity of watching the rise and fall of his chest. The stranger tossed and turned in the grip of a fever, muttering names that meant nothing to her, echoes of a life left behind. Sarah. The carriage. Forgive me, he whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp that tore at the quiet of the cabin. My Lin sat beside him on the floor, dipping a rag into warm water and dabbing his forehead. She saw the scars on his knuckles and the callousness of his palms. These were the hands of a man who could build empires or destroy them, yet here he was, reduced to the dependency of a child. The intimacy of the situation was terrifying to her. She had spent years avoiding the gaze of men, knowing that in the eyes of the town she was either invisible or a target. Yet, this man was different. Even in his delirium, there was no malice in his face, only a profound, etching pain. The firelight danced across his features, softening the hard lines of his brow. Outside, the storm raged on, a chaotic symphony of nature's wrath, but inside, a strange peace began to settle. It was the peace of survival, the quiet acknowledgement that two broken things had found each other in the dark. She did not sleep that night. She kept the fire fed, watching over this stranger who had fallen from the sky, wondering if his arrival was a curse or the answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to speak. Morning broke with a deceptive brightness, the sun reflecting off the snow with a blinding glare that pierced through the cracks in the cabin walls. The wind had died down, leaving behind a world sculptured in white silence. Gideon Blackwood opened his eyes. The first sensation was not sight, but smell, the scent of wood smoke, dried sage, and something earthy, like simmering roots. Then came the pain. His head throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, and his limbs felt heavy, as if his blood had been replaced with lead. He tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness slammed him back against the floorboards. He blinked, his vision clearing slowly. He was not in the snow. He was not dead. He was in a small, low-ceilinged room that smelled of poverty and cleanliness. Above him, hanging from the rafters, were bundles of drying herbs. To his right, a small cast-iron stove radiated heat. And then he saw her. She was standing by the single window, her back to him, the morning light turning her white dress into a halo. Her black hair hung in a long, simple braid down her back. Gideon squinted, his memory a fragmented mess of white drifts and freezing cold. He remembered the horse stumbling, the long walk, the crushing weight of his grief driving him forward until his legs gave out. He tried to speak, but his throat was like sandpaper. "Water," he croaked. The word was barely a sound, but the woman turned instantly. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable, but her eyes were dark and intelligent. She didn't scream or flinch. She simply picked up a tin cup, dipped it into a bucket, and knelt beside him. She slipped a hand behind his head, her fingers were small but surprisingly strong, and lifted him so he could drink. The water was cool and tasted of iron. He drank greedily, coughing as the liquid hit his parched throat. "Slowly," she said. Her voice was soft, accented with a lilt he hadn't heard in years, melodic and distinct from the harsh drawls of the territory. "Where?" Gideon started, pulling himself up to a sitting position, clutching the quilt to his chest. He realized with a start that he was undressed, wearing only his long johns. His clothes were hanging near the fire, dry now but stiff with salt and dirt. "You are in my home," My Lin said, retreating to a safe distance near the stove. "You collapsed at my door." The storm was bad. Gideon looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the distinct features of her heritage, the plainness of her dress, the poverty of the room. He knew this town, he knew the prejudices that rotted the hearts of men in these parts. For a Chinese woman to be living alone this far out. She was vulnerable. And by taking in a strange white man, she had invited a danger she couldn't possibly understand. "I'm Gideon," he said, his voice stronger now, regaining the baritone authority he was used to commanding. "Gideon Blackwood." She nodded once, a small dip of her chin. "I am My Lin." "How long was I out?" 2 days. The fever was high. 2 days. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble. He had lost 2 days to the void. He looked at his hand and saw the ring. The pain of Sarah's death hit him then, a fresh wave of nausea. He had been riding to Artranet, but it had found him even here. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. He wasn't used to thanking people, he was used to paying them. "You saved my life, my Lynn." "You are heavy," she said simply, a flicker of something almost like humor in her eyes. "It was not easy." Gideon looked down at his own massive frame and then at her slight figure. A sudden, fierce protectiveness surged in him. She had dragged him in. She had stripped him, warmed him, and watched over him. "I have nothing to pay you with," he lied, instinctively hiding his wealth. He needed to know who she was before he revealed the gold in his saddlebags, if his horse had even survived. "I did not ask for payment," she replied, turning back to the pot on the stove. "Eat now. You need strength." The days that followed fell into a quiet, hypnotic rhythm. Gideon was too weak to leave, his body recovering from the deep chill that had settled in his bones. He spent the daylight hours sitting by the fire or on the small porch, wrapped in the quilt, watching my Lynn work. She was a marvel of efficiency. She moved with a grace that belied the harshness of her chores. He watched her chop wood, the axe heavy in her hands, swinging with a precise rhythm. He watched her mend the roof with scavenged strips of tin. He watched her cook meager meals from almost nothing, watery broth thickened with roots, stale bread softened in the steam. It was a poverty so absolute it made his stomach churn, yet she bore it with a dignity that shamed him. He was a man who had owned railroads and cattle herds, who had thrown away fortunes on bad bets just to feel something, and here she was, treating a single potato like a treasure. By the fourth day, Gideon's strength began to return. He was not a man who could sit idle. His stoicism, usually a wall to keep people out, became a tool for observation. He saw the draft coming through the bottom of the door. He saw the wobbly leg of the table. He saw the way the wind rattled the single pane of glass in the window. Without asking, he began to work. He found a toolbox in the corner, dusty and half forgotten. He didn't speak much, and neither did she. Their communication was in the passing of a hammer, the holding of a plank, the nod of acknowledgement when a job was done. He fixed the table leg first. Then he rehung the door so it sat flush against the frame, sealing out the biting draft. He spent an entire afternoon securing the loose shingles on the roof, his breath misting in the cold air, his dark coat buttoned tight against the wind. My Lynn watched him from the garden where she was digging for winter carrots. She had expected him to leave as soon as he could walk. She had not expected him to take ownership of her hardships. "It pulls to the left," Gideon said one evening, pointing to the chimney flue. "Smoke's not drawing right." My Lynn looked up from her sewing. "It has always been that way." "It doesn't have to be," he grunted. He spent the next hour dismantling the pipe, cleaning out the soot, and reassembling it with a mixture of mud and clay he mixed himself. When he lit the fire that night, the smoke spiraled perfectly upward, and the cabin was warmer than it had been in years. "You have skilled hands," My Lynn said softly, placing a bowl of stew before him. Gideon looked at his hands, scarred and large. "They're good for work." "Not much else lately." "Work is enough," she said. "It keeps the mind quiet." He looked at her then, really seeing the wisdom behind her youth. She knew about grief too. He could see it in the way she sometimes paused, staring out at the snow-covered tree line. They were two wounded animals licking their wounds in the same den, finding comfort in the silence of the other. But the world outside their sanctuary was not content to leave them be. The supplies were running dangerously low. The jar of flour was empty, and the dried meat was gone. Gideon knew they had to go to town. He also knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, what that meant for My Lynn. He had seen the way she flinched when he mentioned the settlement of Oak Haven. "I need to go to the trading post," Gideon announced on the 6th morning, buckling his belt. He had cleaned his clothes as best he could, he looked less like a corpse and more like a drifter now, albeit an imposing one. "I will go," My Lynn said quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. "You are still recovering." "I'm fine," he countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. "And you're not carrying 50 pounds of flour back in this snow. They do not like me there," she whispered, looking down at her shoes. "Then they'll have to deal with me," Gideon said, grabbing his coat. He paused, then added, softer, "I'm not letting you go alone, my Lin. Not anymore." She looked up, startled by the intensity in his voice. It was the first time he had openly offered her protection. It was a terrifying, wonderful promise. The walk to town was a trudge through knee-deep sludge, the pristine white of the wilderness giving way to the brown, churned filth of civilization. Oak Haven was a scar on the landscape, a collection of false front buildings and muddy streets. As they entered the main thoroughfare, the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned. Whispers hissed like snakes from the boardwalks. Gideon walked with his head high, his stride purposeful, My Lin a half-step behind him, her head bowed. He could feel the eyes on them, judgmental, hostile, curious. A white man walking with a Chinese woman was a scandal, a white man living with one was an abomination in their narrow minds. They reached the general store, a cluttered establishment that smelled of sawdust and tobacco. The bell chimed as they entered. The conversation inside died instantly. Behind the counter stood Barnaby Hatcher, the town's wealthiest merchant and unofficial mayor. He was a portly man with a red face and eyes that gleamed with malice. "Well now," Hatcher sneered, leaning over the counter. "Look what the cat dragged in. Didn't think we'd be seeing you until spring thaw, girl. Or did you finally run out of roots to dig?" My Lin said nothing, moving to the shelves to find flour. Hatcher's eyes slid to Gideon. "And who's this?" "Another stray dog you're feeding." Gideon stepped forward, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He towered over Hatcher, casting a long shadow over the counter. The silence in the room grew heavy, charged with violence. "The name is Blackwood," Gideon said, his voice low and vibrating with a menace that made Hatcher blink. "And I'd advise you to speak with respect, or I'll teach you the meaning of the word." Hatcher bristled, his face turning a deeper shade of crimson. "Now listen here, drifter. You don't come into my town, Ann." "I'm buying supplies," Gideon interrupted, slamming a gold coin onto the counter, a coin he had fished from the hidden lining of his boot. The sound rang out like a gunshot. "Flour. Bacon. Coffee. The best you have. And if I hear one more word that isn't about the price, I'm taking my business, and my patience, elsewhere." The sight of the gold shut Hatcher up instantly. Greed warred with prejudice in his eyes, and greed won. But as they packed the supplies, Gideon caught Hatcher staring at My Lin with a look that was not just hateful, but predatory. It was the look of a man who realized that the woman he had scorned now had a protector, and he hated her all the more for it. The war had begun. The journey back to the cabin was undertaken in a silence that felt fundamentally different from the one that had accompanied them to town. Before, the silence had been born of necessity and survival. Now, it was heavy with unsaid things, a tension that hummed like a telegraph wire in the wind. The supplies weighed heavy in Gideon's pack, flour, sugar, coffee, and a slab of cured bacon, but the weight was nothing compared to the dark cloud of Barnaby Hatcher's gaze that seemed to follow them all the way to the tree line. When they finally crossed the threshold of the shack, bolting the door against the encroaching twilight, the relief was physical. The cabin, with its mended roof and roaring stove, felt less like a shelter and more like a fortress. Gideon set the pack down and immediately turned to check on My Lin. She was trembling, not just from the cold, but from the exposure to the town's venom. He watched her take off her thin shawl, her movements stiff and jerky. Without a word, he moved to the stove, stoked the fire until the iron belly glowed cherry red, and then did something that made her freeze. He took her small, cold hands in his large, callous ones and began to rub them. His skin was rough, scarred from years of labor and fighting, but his touch was incredibly gentle. The contrast between his size and his tenderness was a shock to her system. She had spent her life making herself small to avoid notice, yet here was a man who filled the room, making her feel seen in a way that was both terrifying and intoxicating. "They cannot hurt you here," Gideon said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I won't let them." My Lin looked up at him, her dark eyes wide. She had never known the touch of a man, never known the protective weight of a partner. She was a virgin in every sense of the word, untouched by romance, unscarred by the specific heartbreaks of courtship, but deeply wounded by the world's neglect. Gideon saw this innocence. It radiated from her like heat from a flame. It shamed him for his past failures and ignited a fierce desire to preserve it. He wasn't just a drifter, he was a man who had lost everything and found a single, fragile flower growing in the ice. He released her hand slowly, the loss of contact leaving a phantom warmth on her skin. That evening, as the scent of baking biscuits, a luxury she hadn't tasted in years, filled the small room, the dynamic shifted. They sat at the table he had fixed, the light of the kerosene lamp casting long, intimate shadows. Gideon watched her eat, noting the delicacy of her manners despite her hunger. He realized then that he wasn't leaving. The thought of riding out when the snow melted, of leaving her to the wolves like Hatcher, was physically painful. The storm had brought him here to die, but she had forced him to live. And now, the debt of his life demanded payment in a currency he hadn't thought he possessed anymore: devotion. The peace of their sanctuary was shattered 3 days later, not by the weather, but by the poison Hatcher had dripped into the ears of the town. It began with a rock thrown against the side of the cabin in the dead of night, a sharp crack that woke Gideon instantly. He was out of his makeshift bed on the floor and reaching for the revolver he had cleaned and oiled before his eyes fully adjusted to the dark. My Lin sat up in her bunk, clutching the quilt to her chest, her breathing shallow and fast. "Stay down," Gideon commanded, his voice devoid of sleep, sharp and alert as a soldier's. He moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutter. Outside, torches flickered against the snow like angry fireflies. A group of 6 men stood at the edge of the clearing, their breath misting in the freezing air. Hatcher was at the front, looking bloated and self-righteous in a fur-lined coat. They weren't just a mob, they were a tribunal, convinced of their own moral superiority. "Come out, Blackwood!" Hatcher bellowed, his voice slurred with Dutch courage. "And send the girl out too. We don't take kindly to thieves and harlots living in sin on town land." The accusation hung in the frozen air, ugly and false. Gideon looked back at My Lin. She was terrified, a deer caught in the sights, but she didn't cry. She swung her legs out of bed and reached for her dress, her jaw set in a line of grim determination. She would not cower. Gideon felt a surge of pride so intense it nearly knocked him over. She was stronger than any of them. He walked to the door, the heavy oak planks vibrating with the force of his steps. He unlatched it and stepped out onto the porch, the freezing wind whipping his shirt, but he didn't seem to feel it. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, near the revolver, looking down at the men with the disdain of a lion regarding a pack of hyenas. The torches illuminated his face, hard, unforgiving, and utterly unafraid. "This is not town land," Gideon said, his voice projecting clearly over the wind. "And the only thieves I see are the ones trying to steal a woman's peace in the middle of the night." "That gold coin was stolen!" Hatcher shouted, pointing a shaking finger. "No drifter carries mint-fresh gold unless he robbed a bank or a dead man. We're here to see justice done. And to remove that temptation from our midst." "Justice," Gideon repeated, the word tasting like ash. He stepped off the porch, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. The men instinctively took a step back. "You wouldn't know justice if it looked you in the eye." "You want the woman? You'll have to step over my dead body to get to her. And I promise you, Hatcher, you'll be the first to fall." The standoff was electric. Hatcher's men looked at Gideon's size, at the confident set of his shoulders, and their resolve wavered. They were bullies, not warriors. Gideon's hand hovered near his gun, but his eyes promised a violence far more personal than a bullet. For a moment, it seemed the violence would erupt, staining the white snow red. But then My Lin stepped onto the porch. She held a lantern, the light illuminating her pale, resolute face. She didn't speak, but her presence, ghostly, dignified, and undeniably human, broke the spell of the mob's frenzy. They weren't attacking a monster, they were attacking a girl in a white dress. The shame of it seemed to seep into the soberer men in the back. Hatcher spat in the snow, sensing his support crumbling. "This ain't over, Blackwood," he snarled. "Winter lasts a long time. We'll freeze you out." The retreat of the mob left a silence that was louder than their shouting. Gideon barred the door and turned to My Lin. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold clarity. They couldn't go on like this. Hatcher would return, and next time he might bring the sheriff, or fire. The accusation of living in sin was their weapon. It gave the town a moral excuse to destroy them. Gideon looked at the woman who had saved him. She was placing the lantern back on the table, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed. He saw the curve of her neck, the braid resting against her back, the simple grace of her existence. He realized that protecting her wasn't enough. He needed to claim her, not as a possession, but as a partner. He needed to give her a shield that even Hatcher's bigotry couldn't pierce. He walked over to her, the floorboards creaking. He waited until she turned to face him. Her eyes were wide, fearful of what the future held. "My Lin," he started, his voice rough with emotion he wasn't used to expressing. "They won't stop. As long as you are the outcast and I am the stranger, they will hunt us." "I know," she whispered. "I should leave. I am the cause of this." "No," Gideon said firmly, stepping closer. "You are the only reason I am alive. You are the only good thing in this godforsaken territory." He took a deep breath, the magnitude of what he was about to say settling over him like a heavy coat. "I am a man with a past full of ghosts. I have nothing to offer but my hands and my name. But my name, it carries weight in places these people don't know about yet. I want to give it to you." He went down on one knee. It was a stiff, awkward movement for a man of his size, but he did it with a solemnity that made the small cabin feel like a cathedral. He took her hand again. "Marry me," he said. "Be my wife. Let me give you the protection of my name and the devotion of my heart. I cannot promise you an easy life, but I swear on the grave of my fathers, I will never let you be cold or hungry or afraid again." My Lin stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't a proposal born of fiery passion, but of ironclad duty and a budding, profound love. It was a promise of safety. For a woman who had known only peril, it was the most romantic thing she had ever heard. "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I will be your wife, Gideon." The ceremony was as stark and simple as the landscape around them. There was no preacher, the town's reverend was in Hatcher's pocket, so they made their vows to God and the mountains. Gideon found a small Bible in the bottom of his pack, the leather worn and cracked. He read the passages by the light of the fire, his voice steady and resonant. My Lin wore her best white dress, the one she had saved for her burial, but now it served a purpose of life. Gideon placed his own heavy silver ring on a chain around her neck, promising to replace it with gold as soon as the snow cleared. It was a strange union, the wealthy, widowed tycoon hiding in plain sight and the destitute, virgin healer who had scraped survival from the dirt. But as they stood before the hearth, holding hands, the bond between them solidified into something unbreakable. That night, for the first time, Gideon did not sleep on the floor. He shared the narrow bunk with her, not in a carnal act. He treated her with a reverence reserved for holy things, knowing her innocence required patience, but in a protective embrace. He held her as one holds a precious, fragile treasure, his large body shielding her from the draft, his heartbeat a steady rhythm against her back. They lay together in the dark, trauma-bonded and finally, truly safe in the arms of the other. The wind howled outside, impotent against the warmth of their union. But the world of men demands paper and proof, and Hatcher was not done. 2 weeks later, as the first thaw began to drip from the eaves, the sheriff arrived. He was a tall, gaunt man named Miller, weary and easily bought. He rode up with Hatcher and a dozen deputies, surrounding the cabin in the bright, glaring light of noon. This was the end game. Hatcher intended to drag Gideon to jail for theft and drive My Lin into the wilderness to perish. "Gideon Blackwood!" Sheriff Miller called out, his hand on his holster. "Come out with your hands raised. You're under arrest for the theft of gold currency and vagrancy." The door opened. Gideon stepped out, but he didn't raise his hands. He was dressed in his black suit, which My Lin had cleaned and pressed until it looked almost new. He had shaved, revealing the sharp, aristocratic line of his jaw. He looked every inch the titan of industry he had left behind in the East. My Lin stood beside him, her head high, wearing the silver ring on the chain. "I suggest you rethink that order, Sheriff," Gideon said, his voice calm, carrying the absolute authority of a man who commands armies of workers. "Don't listen to him, Miller." Hatcher screamed, his face purple. "He's a broke drifter. Drag him out." Gideon reached into his coat pocket. The deputies tensed, hands flying to guns. But Gideon pulled out a document, sealed with red wax, and a leather wallet bulging with papers. The gold coin wasn't stolen, Gideon announced, his voice booming. It was minted by the Blackwood Rail and Steel Company. "My company." He threw the wallet to the sheriff. Miller caught it, opened it, and his face went pale. He looked at the bank drafts, the identification, the deeds. "This town," Gideon continued, stepping off the porch, his eyes boring into Hatcher, "sits on land that was mortgaged to the Denver Trust 3 years ago. A mortgage that I purchased last week via courier from the trading post in the next valley." A gasp went through the mob. Hatcher's jaw dropped. "I own the deed to the general store. I own the deed to the livery. I own the note on your house." Hatcher Gideon's voice dropped to a terrifying whisper as he closed the distance. "I am not a vagrant. I am your landlord. And this woman is my lawful wife." The vindication was absolute. The silence that followed was total, broken only by the dripping of melting snow. Hatcher shrank back, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to crush an ant and found himself standing under the boot of a giant. Gideon didn't need to throw a punch. His status, revealed at the perfect moment, was a sledgehammer that shattered the town's hierarchy. The MIC drop was palpable. Gideon put his arm around My Lin, pulling her close. "My wife and I will be making changes to how this town is run," he said, scanning the faces of the men who had scorned her. "Cruelty will no longer be the currency of Oak Haven. Clear out. All of you." They scattered like roaches exposed to light. Spring came to the high country in a rush of green and gold. The cabin was gone, replaced by a sprawling timber home with glass windows that looked out over the valley. Gideon and My Lin stood on the wraparound porch, watching the wildflowers bloom where the snow had once tried to bury them. My Lin was no longer the ghost of the tree line, she was the matriarch of the valley, respected, feared by some, loved by many, and dressed in silks that matched the brightness of her spirit. Gideon stood behind her, his hands resting on her shoulders, his face softened by a peace he hadn't thought possible after Sarah. They had healed each other, the broken widower and the outcast virgin, forging a love that was stronger than the winter, harder than iron, and warmer than the sun. They say the past is a foreign country, but for Gideon and My Lin, the future was home.